just conscious of time, if you wish.
Okay. We can give it one more minute, I think, before we get going, but thanks everyone for joining us so far. We'll get going very soon. All right. Okay, welcome everyone for the final webinar that we're running at the centre before the break for the summer. I'll start again in September. I'm Colin Rose. I'm a senior research fellow at UCL, and I just want to thank everyone who's attended these webinars up till now, and to all of you for joining us today. Today's webinar will be recorded, and please keep your mics on mute until the Q&A at the end. We're very lucky to be joined today by Morgan Lewis, who's CEO of Material Index, who will talk about how his company is acting now. So great to have someone who's on the ground making reuse happen and can talk really well to the topic of enabling material reuse in construction at scale through improved audits and material brokerage. We've got 45 minutes, so we're going to give Morgan about 25 minutes to do his presentation, and then we'll have Q&A. Please add your questions as you go in the chat, and then at the end, if you'd like to raise your hand to ask a question directly, that's also great. Before handing over, a few words about our speaker. Morgan Lewis is an architect with degrees from Cambridge, Cooper Union, New York, and is a Rome Scholar in Architecture from 2017. Structural Timber Design Award winner 2018, and spent a decade in practice before launching Material Index. He's one of the founding directors of Material Index, alongside mechanical engineer Rob Smith and software developer Ellis Dodwell. Material Index is based in Farringdon in London and has an integrated digital platform for undertaking pre-demolition audits and secondary material brokering, or salvaging as it's traditionally known. Their platform and services are used by commercial real estate owners and specialist contractors. One of the purposes of Material Index is to provide the relevant information to building owners, designers and contractors ahead of deconstruction on what can be done with these components and how they should be deconstructed. The importance of this feedback loop to growing the circular economy in construction is the purpose of the talk today. I'll stop sharing now and hand over to you, Morgan. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for the kind introduction, Colin, and nice to meet everyone. I hope you can all hear and now see this okay?
Yeah, got it.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, delighted to be talking this lunchtime. As Colin said, I'll be speaking for about 25 minutes. I will speak a little bit about what we do, particularly at the sort of start of the presentation, but really trying to focus in on, particularly as this is predominantly an academic audience, the kind of how we see from our perspective the kind of structural issues around auditing and material sales, and how we see that as a way of scaling up material reuse in construction. Yeah, I'll take questions at the end, and we'll just dive right into it. So, I mean, I think we probably all know why material reuse in construction is important. I'll kind of just reiterate it. So the UK's most wasteful industry by volume. Over half of all waste, if you think household waste is mid-20s%, it's a lot more wasteful than that. Now, a good chunk of that is kind of soil waste, but that actually faces the same dynamics as all other component types. And there's a huge amount of carbon in that waste as well. And it's particularly shocking because the reuse rate in construction is very low if you compare it to even things like sort of leading types of electronics or cars. And it's actually a bit surprising because actually often after a component or material has been used in the building, often there's a huge amount of technical life left in it, but it's still being sent to the waste stream or extreme downcycling, not always because it doesn't have capability, but because the supply chain and the decision-making processes around getting it out of a building, getting it resold, particularly complicated. And they're kind of, the result of this is that there's a huge amount of unnecessary waste being generated. And if you diverted it towards reuse, you'd actually be a great source of low carbon products. And it's estimated that over 36 billion pounds of valuable materials are being wasted each year in Europe. Now, if we think about that just in terms of one material category, and I always find these statistics actually hard to believe, but they come from very reputable sources, and I used to buy quite a lot of bricks, so I can believe them. In the UK, it's estimated we buy over 2 billion bricks each year. It's actually estimated we demolish about 2 billion, although the statistics are harder to find on that. And it's estimated that we reuse as a brick each year around 100 million. Now, that goes through careful disaggregation of a wall, palletizing of the bricks, sending it to a brickyard, and then usually it ending up in a new building or a refurbished building. Now, obviously, a lot of those bricks that are otherwise demolished do become valuable aggregate, but a lot of them are buried. But if we want to supply low carbon materials to the construction industry, we need to get a lot better at getting more components back into that supply chain, into this reuse column. And if we just think about a typical kind of British building that is brick clad and needs to be retrofitted, so it needs to be re-insulated, and therefore the external face of brick needs to come down. A project manager or a contractor working on that retrofit project needs to know in advance of deconstructing that brick wall for those bricks to end up in the reuse supply chain. How many bricks are there? What condition are they in? How easy is it to disaggregate them? What would be the impact on program? What would they get on the secondhand market? And what would the logistics costs be involved in getting them to that market? And generally, it's helping with that decision making ahead of time that is the primary aim of Material Index, in order to get hold of this good quality supply. Generally, we find when we have good supply, we can get it sold. It's generally making sure that the deconstruction of buildings, more materials are ending up in that supply chain. And so I will just speak a little bit about how we do that before going into why it's so important that that information is available to everyone ahead of time, and some of the complexity involved in getting that information to the right people. So first of all, essentially we do two things. We undertake pre-demolition audits, or people licensing our product undertake pre-demolition audits, and we sell materials through a private marketplace to trade partners. So these tend to be other businesses, either businesses like brickyards or original equipment manufacturers or contractors. But the principle is, as I outlined just there, it's a way of cataloging what's in a building, finding a good way of managing it through a digital platform, and then enabling the exchange of those materials. And so, yeah, the way it works kind of sequentially is that there's a deconstruction project, refit, retrofit, whole-scale demolition. There is a surveying process. We have the option of sending people to site, or we have contractors who use our product. There's a collaborative decision-making page, which is quite important. There's the ability to download analytics, and there's the ability to push valuable components to our marketplace. And it's really this kind of connection between what can sell and how it should be taken down that is really at the heart of what we do. We generally work for commercial landlords, generally in office and retail space, and there are some advantages to that. The scale of the buildings tends to be a little bit larger, which can definitely make the logistics add up on material reuse a little bit easier, and a little bit more standardization of the components in the building as well. We also license our product, and we're working on a couple of interesting innovation projects. Now, if I kind of just sort of part that there as kind of description of what we do and how we think that can make a difference, and just sort of step back and think about where is construction now in relation to adopting circular economy principles. There's a couple of areas where we see quite a lot of change and growth. So one is the adoption of circular economy principles in the supply chain and the manufacturers of products which go into buildings. It's great there is a European standard in this area, and there's also a British standard. I always tell architects to point their supply chain towards this and start telling their people they buy their carpets and bricks and M&E equipment from that they should be adopting these circular economy principles. And essentially that covers a wide range of things, but we are seeing more and more manufacturers introduce things like take-back schemes. So taking back the products which they've been installed in their buildings as a way of enabling their reuse. And another area where we're seeing quite a lot of change is around at a building level, understanding that if there's an existing building on a site that's being transformed, either being redeveloped or retrofitted, that there's a lot of existing value and carbon in the materials in that building, and that therefore a circular economy approach should be taken to the retrofit or development of that building, i.e. there should be a hierarchy where as much as possible is retained, and if not, the materials are reused on site, if not, they're reused off site, if not, they're recycled or sent to waste stream. And there's various ways of kind of factorizing this, and of course you can provide the embodied carbon, and there's embodied carbon methodologies which can be kind of part of the decision-making process. I mean, it is worth saying there's also quite a lot of innovation in new materials which make use of secondary material streams, but generally we're seeing the most change in these two areas. And that is kind of being backed up by legislation in the industry and guidance. And so there is more push by local authorities, particularly in London. We're also seeing it in Scotland and in Cardiff and Manchester. A push for a greater understanding of what should be done with the components in an existing building to enable more circular economy, and generally that's coming through this pre-demolition audit, this requirement to report ahead of time, ahead of a demolition, on what are the materials in a building and what's going to happen to them. But we are also seeing changes in the product guidance as well. But what we're seeing, or what we've seen generally on the ground, and there are some great exceptions, is that most pre-demolition audits, most attempts by players in the industry to really get a grip on what is in their buildings, and it's kind of astonishing quite often like how little information there can be on buildings, is when they're not doing a very sort of just very high level audit and they are really going into some detail, is that it becomes very unmanageable very quickly. I mean, we'll typically break down, you know, 5-story office block into 600 to 800 component types, but it will often end up just in lots and lots of spreadsheets. If a contractor is doing it themselves, or if a concerned landlord is, and it's very difficult to interrogate. It's very difficult to make those decisions with the right information on, well, what should we do with this component? And the other kind of key thing that we're seeing that these audits often lack good visibility on, or that the decision-making process around enabling more reuse really suffers from, is around certification, not knowing what the right certification pathways are for certain materials for them to be either reused on site, or finding buyers who can deal with this certification, or buyers who are unconcerned by the certification. And we think that's kind of really kind of interesting and, well, actually quite challenging at a kind of structural level, the fact that there's a kind of big push for audits and that people are trying, but they're kind of disaggregated from market information and that they're quite hard to interrogate. And generally, it's not kind of changing what is one of the kind of fundamental reasons why the reclaim industry is smaller than it could be. And at least this is our kind of analysis, and it's a very simple diagram I'm showing here, which is kind of massively simplified what's in the kind of waste stream, a lot of which isn't technically waste. But our analysis of kind of why so few good quality materials are ending up in the reclaim stream is that the reclaim industry often engages with the demolition process quite late in the day. So after that brick wall has come down, and that will often mean that they are not able to inform that deconstruction process and know about it in advance, where they could kind of recommend better ways of getting high reclamation rates or offer prices that would encourage more reclamation rates. And with a lot of components, that will actually make quite a big difference. So something like a ceiling tile or a kitchen unit, most contractors will not consider a way of taking it down carefully unless they've been given a price in advance, unless that market connection is made. And of course, most components in a building do have value when they're in situ. And at some point, as soon as that door is taken off its hinges and put into a pile on a site, if it's technically discarded, it becomes a waste stream. And even if it isn't technically discarded, it becomes a real battle against the program of the site to get it sold. And so really the key thing, we think, is having a very good pre-demolition audit, which could be described as a type of building or materials passport. So a description of what's in the building. Getting that to feed effectively into the deconstruction tender, but also getting it to include as much information and as live a link as possible with the reclaim industry. And that way more materials can be diverted from deconstruction towards reclaim. And we recently integrated storage into our platform, as well as more community groups, and the ability for this to be done at a portfolio scale where it becomes more effective. And essentially, what I mean by that is that if you've got a number of buildings from the same owner working on the same platform, you can start to share a few more materials between them and start to plan more around what secondary material streams you would use. And you also have a better sense of what materials will be becoming available. And so it's really, at that point, the pre-demolition audit, this material passport, actually starts to become the kind of bedrock for much greater material reuse. Now, we personally haven't seen this work effectively yet at a kind of portfolio level, but we're definitely seeing it work at a building level. And we think that this kind of, this feedback loop between what you can do with components, who wants them, how much it costs to store them, exactly the right prescription on how they can be recertified and taken down. That feedback loop between that and the material passports, the pre-demolition audit, is really key. So a very simple example that we were on site just yesterday with a ceiling tile manufacturer who had like very prescriptive advice on how the material tiles needed to be stacked in order for them to be taken back. Otherwise, they would refuse to take them back. And they were actually sending out their own pallets, and they had to be stacked a certain height on site, and they had to be segregated. But all of which was profitable for the demolition contractor. The supplier in that case was paying for them. But that feedback loop and that intelligence is kind of really critical, that needs to be there much earlier in the process than it is now. And that is what we think will unlock much more material reuse. And we think this is particularly kind of important for where the industry is right now, because we begin to see much more of a tipping point for reuse. We have a lot of people contact us for low carbon materials in construction. Construction is a very difficult area of the economy to decarbonize. And it would much slower than, say, the grid, for example. So embodied carbon in buildings will become an increasingly big problem as the UK heads towards net zero. And by providing this information, we can achieve much higher reuse rates on projects. So that was a bit of a kind of whistle-stop tour of kind of what we do and why we think this matters. And now I'll sort of pause for queries. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Morgan. So the floor's open for questions. Please either put them in the Q&A box or raise your hand. And perhaps we can start with a question about where you see significant opportunities for growth in this area.
I think the thing, and this is like a very kind of personal view, we're not academics, so we actually don't have that great an understanding of kind of at a sort of structural level, kind of material flows at a sort of structural level. But I guess where we tend to be most optimistic is we're seeing when we speak to manufacturers, definitely over the last sort of 12 to 24 months, there's now a much greater understanding that they should be doing a take-back scheme and thinking about how they implement it. It hasn't always passed through their like business development teams, but you know, most of them, they've heard the terms and they're thinking about how do we get our products back. And then they start thinking, well, we don't even know where they are. And then they start thinking about, okay, what is the unit economics on if we have to pass that second-hand ceiling tile back through our kind of manufacturing line. I think construction is actually in quite an advantageous position compared to some industries in this respect, in that it's not as internationally kind of distributed as a lot of manufacturing chains. Obviously, it's still pretty international, but much less so than. So basically, there is still a lot of like manufacturing capability in Europe and the UK, so there is at least a plant you can send the component back to. Yeah, I think we'll see a lot more growth in that area, personally. And
I mean, localizing supply chains is one of the key things that reuse sort of does by virtue of the fact that waste emerges everywhere. But when you're seeing suppliers considering take back, that must be with relatively recent products, because a lot of the stuff that you must be identifying in your audits is from way before existing suppliers were around. Or are you able to find, allocate products from, construction from decades ago to current manufacturers?
Yeah, I think that's a really kind of interesting point. The kind of the rates of obsolescence will vary quite a lot, kind of component to component. And so something like Windows, extremely challenging because they kind of, the rate of obsolescence is very fast. With some things, it can be sort of surprisingly slow. So, like, I mean, we once found a manufacturer of parquet flooring, and they hadn't really changed their manufacturing technique in about 90 years. So you could sort of send them back the parquet, and they would just sort of sand it down. So it does vary quite a lot. I guess. Yeah, and I think sometimes this question of like how local a reuse supply chain is or should be is something I think maybe the jury is more out on than is sometimes assumed. Like, I know in that big EU research project, they found on average secondhand materials were traveling just as fast as new materials, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but that would be our experience of the reclaim industry. So even like traditional salvage industry, like a lot of stuff will get shipped to America. And when you look at plant, quite a lot of stuff end up in the Middle East. Obviously we would like, I guess the flip side of that would be maybe the operational carbon involved in the logistics is not being taken into account enough around the decision making. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. A couple of questions from Freya in the chat. Freya, would you like to ask yourself? I can pick them up.
Yeah, I can. Yep. Down here in rainy Kent. So I mean, we've heard yesterday the number 11, the new chancellor, lay out a new agenda on planning and planning reform to increase the amount of housing, but obviously that's infrastructure and wind turbines and obviously the other infrastructure that goes with that. So we're at this real juncture of needing to get these ideas in these changes, and I just wonder whether you're in any way engaged in or with associations at the forefront of ensuring that these critical ideas are going to be incorporated into new planning legislation. And also the other point about procurement. Procurement is a huge driver for change in terms of use of materials and specification, around sustainability and circularity. We're seeing that in the EU. So I'm just kind of wondering if your finger on the pulse and what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah. So actually, I haven't sort of digested the kind of muted planning reforms. I mean, maybe rather selfishly, but actually I also think really importantly, kind of requirements for much better pre-demolition audits as a part of the planning process, the way we've seen in London being rolled out elsewhere across the UK would be really welcome. I think they do make a huge difference, particularly when they're coupled with like whole life carbon analysis. I think, and I'd actually be quite curious to know, and it's not something we've done any research into, but maybe some academics on the call have, like, obviously there is now a gate fee for a lot of waste, but I would expect the public sector still incurs a large cost from the huge amount of waste which construction generates, and therefore, and a lot of that I think falls on local authorities. So I would have thought there's actually quite a strong just cost benefit analysis argument to be made at a local level, just saying, if we ask contractors and developers to report on this more earlier and made greater efforts to divert waste from either recycling centres or landfill, that would actually save them money, as well as promoting other things in the local economy. There's a kind of call out for that. In terms of, like the kind of, I used to be in house building in quite a serious way, and I didn't know the shares of the major house builders went up prior to the announcement, which made me think that actually this is not going. Generally, the government tends to really not step on the toes of the house builders, even to the point of the fact that I think we're still allowing new house builders or new houses that have just recently been specified to still have gas boilers in them, which from a kind of energy point of view seems to me to be perfectly insane, but is a kind of indication of their kind of stranglehold on policy, and which is maybe a cynical point of view. But so I'm sort of waiting to see the detail on that and whether it will be more than just a kind of it will actually be something which kind of changes their practices as well as just allows them to build on more land. We're not engaged in lobbying at all. We're very happy to kind of contribute to other people's like research projects, and we'd love to support that, but it's just not something we're engaged in and probably don't have the resource for. It's kind of our feeling. Sort of slightly, I'm not entirely convinced how I feel about sort of private sector companies lobbying anyway. In terms of procurement, I think there is huge scope there for better procurement. I mean, I think we've seen some great practices like you mentioned in Europe, where they're starting to say at contract level, 20% of these materials need to come from recycling streams and 20% need to come from reuse streams, or even doing that through things like cradle-to-cradle specifications. So some large public buildings in Belgium have sort of, they need to set a certain percentage of the building, the components in the building need to come from cradle-to-cradle certified suppliers. I think I did see a contract that followed that for a new battery facility in the UK, which was the first time I'd seen it where a state body had sort of put a particular kind of high reuse target in a kind of building contract. But yeah, that seems very much like sort of tip of the iceberg. I mean, yeah, so sorry, not particularly kind of specific answers, apart from yes, we would love to see more. We would love to see more public sector procurement contracts mention reuse and using secondary materials as a way of driving up supply. And we'd definitely like to see more and clearer pre-demolition audit guidance spread across the UK local authority landscape. Yeah.
We could come back to whether there are any lessons there from France or elsewhere, but let's go to Ben's question next.
Hi, yeah, cheers for that presentation. That was really good. So I work for Reesley, and we do a lot of pre-demolition audits. Well, like exclusively, basically. My day job is so much data, and so my question is, how do you think we kind of reduce the burden of capturing all that data on auditors? I think because obviously it would be amazing to scale it up, but it is a really big job, and it's quite error prone, I think, as well. So I was just wondering, seeing as you're in the same kind of field and thinking about data and reuse and circular economy, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's a problem we really wrestled with. Obviously, we have our own kind of surveying software, and I guess that's kind of the core of what we've been doing. And I didn't give a demo, but anyone can kind of reach out to me separately if they're interested. It's essentially just kind of go in more detail on that. It's a kind of, we don't take, it's not like a point cloud or a photogrammetry kind of surveying technique, but we can take those models. It's a photo-based technique with lots of features in the software. Essentially, for people who think I'm speaking gobbledygook, it's essentially you need a way of counting what's in buildings quickly and working out their quantities as well. So, and it's actually, I don't think any of us really have an intuitive sense of how heavy a building is, or how heavy a floor is, or how heavy a refurbishment is. But essentially, that kind of information is really important for a good pre-demolition audit. Speed is a really big thing, as you kind of maybe alluded to, in that we put our tool in the hands of contractors, and they do want much better audits. So when we audited a couple of contractors' audits, they were out by about 50%, and they kind of know this because they do their post-waste reconciling. But even for professionals who are going in and out of buildings all day and pay for the amount of materials, they take the risk on the amount of materials in a building when they quote for a project, essentially. They find it really difficult to estimate. I think we're doing quite a lot of work on benchmarking. I think that's probably where we're trying to improve. So things which aren't visible or can't be assessed. A lot of people are looking at object recognition through AI of what's in buildings. That's like a big thing, obviously, for self-driving cars and the metaverse. So that we think will bring something in the future around being able to kind of catalog what's in buildings quickly. Yeah, but I guess our focus is kind of on maybe like sort of traditional product development roadmap, where we're like trying to go for like incremental gains quite often, like faster ways of tallying things in a room, faster ways of repeating rooms between floors, better benchmarks for assessing things you can't see, and that kind of thing.
think
Thank
it's probably also the step forward is also in how that data then gets used, because it feels like at the moment pre-demolition audits, not in the case of reusefully a material index, but more broadly across the market, tend to sit in silos and not get not used as a tool to maximize the potential for reuse.
They go and sit in a folder somewhere, I think, a lot of the time. It's changing a little bit sometimes, but that does seem to be the way. I think, also, so something that kind of ties it all together, I guess, like some sort of platform or whatever it is that keeps that sort of record going, I think is definitely useful.
Yeah, the fact that it can be updated at different points in the project is really important, actually. And you can host a meeting around it. Makes a big difference, yeah.
Couple of questions in the Q&A. So from Joanna, there still seems to be a large hesitance to use reused materials by some of the larger construction companies. How do we tackle this?
Yeah, so I'm just going to the right chat.
Please keep them going in the Q&A, then we're all looking in one place. You did make a point earlier about compliance, and I wonder if that's relevant here.
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely relevant. It's quite complicated, and because it's kind of done on a material stream basis, basically. I think, I mean, generally we are seeing change, and it will often be, we've got the same manufacturer, 12 months apart, and the first time they were like, why would we ever do a reuse scheme or take back scheme? The second time they were like, yeah, actually we're kind of thinking quite hard about this. And some of the bigger contractors seem to be thinking the same way, in that they generally they flinch, when you say, can you take these secondary components? And we generally have a policy of not really pushing them too hard. We sort of say, look, this material stream is here, is potentially cheaper. There's potentially all these ways you can work around these problems. So either you can take the risk on the warranty, or you can pay for it to be recertified, or someone in the project can. One thing I would say is a general thing we've observed is actually it can be easier when there's design and build contractors. So contractors who also do the design. And even though a lot of designers are quite keen on reuse, actually kind of almost like these more simplified contractual envelopes can really help. So like if you go to a design and build office fit out contractor and you say, well, I've got these partitions, they can basically make a decision there, like sort of themselves, on whether the design works and whether they want to take any risk around it. And then they can work through logistics questions. If that gets split between like 4 different parties, so you've got an engineer and an architect and a contractor, all of whom are like kind of, you only need one party not to agree for it to become really complicated and slow. So it can sound a bit counterintuitive, but actually we find this kind of more simplified envelope. And then of course, if you can find someone in the supply chain to take, to do that recertification, that's kind of the best outcome. So Siemens goes back to Siemens manufacturer, they restamp it and resell it. Most contractors don't have a problem with that.
And are you finding that market is developing? Do you find it easy to link people up to the recertifiers that they need, or is that still an area where we're struggling?
I would definitely say like reuse on site is always the most complicated. Like where people want to take something down, get it recertified without sending it to a place for recertification or without it sitting somewhere. Because all of a sudden it's becomes like this like uncertainty within a project. I would say that's the hardest part of what we do.
We've got a few minutes left. I'm going to go to Matthew's question. What are your thoughts on the differences, if any, in the markets for an approach to structural reuse as opposed to reuse of fit-out materials and components?
Yeah, I mean, generally there's just fewer players in the kind of structural reuse market. That's one, I guess, big sort of structural difference. With steel reuse, there's a handful of companies that can do that recertification, storage, and resale. Whereas, fit out tends to be much more distributed. I think, obviously, I think actually maybe the UK is a bit different from other places in this, and I've seen a lot of the innovation around structural reuse seems to have taken place in the UK. And we're a very strong kind of structural engineering companies and a lot of interest in this. And it's obviously where like your big carbon wins will often be around your structure. So often it will be 70% of the weight of a building. If it's sort of concrete frame or something. I'll probably just in the interest of time pause there. Yeah, because I know you have to run, Colin.
I do. We've got a couple of minutes, 1 minute. Any final questions from the audience?